Use headphones for best experience.
The sign said diner, and the lot was empty but for 3 sleeping cars. The steak was perfect, too perfect, and behind the kitchen door something heavy was being dragged. Carson's rig rumbled through the desolate night. The interstate narrowed to a makeshift detour around a collapsed overpass that jutted from the darkness like a giant's ribcage. Beneath those concrete bones, a lone diner's neon sign flickered weakly, Verrill's Grin, a toothy yellow beacon in the void. He eased his truck into the crumbling lot. Bone-tired and hungry, Carson remembered fellow drivers raving about this out-of-the-way diner's perfectly cooked meat and cheap plates. Even though the old exit ramp had collapsed and left this stretch almost abandoned, Verrill's Grin stayed stubbornly open, a last outpost of warmth on a dead road. He parked beside 2 other vehicles left cold and empty. Stepping out, he noticed the air was deathly still and tinged with a faint, charred smell. Through the diner's orange glowing windows, nothing stirred inside. A bell jangled as Carson pushed open the glass door. Warm, greasy air enfolded him, laced with the sense of fried fat and an odd, sugary rot. The diner's interior was frozen in time. Scuffed checkerboard tiles, patched vinyl booths, and walls covered in sun-bleached photos of smiling customers. Each smiling face looked a touch too broad, as if forced. Despite the cheerful decor, a heavy stillness hung in the air. "Evening," came a bright voice. Behind the counter stood a waitress in a crisp, pale blue uniform. A pin-on tag on her chest read Rhea. She flashed Carson a wide smile, painted in cherry red lipstick. A smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just you tonight, hon? Sit anywhere you like," Rhea said, cheerfully gesturing with a coffee pot. Carson gave a slight nod and settled into a booth near the counter, one that offered a clear view of the kitchen's swinging door. Rhea came by with a pot of coffee and a menu. "Late night special, all meat plates half off," she said cheerily as she filled his mug. Carson glanced at the menu. Steaks, burgers, a house stew, even something called Verrill's Pride. "What's the pride?" he asked. Rhea's crimson lips curved in a knowing smile. "House specialty, tender as sin, secret recipe that'll put a grin on your face." Carson mustered a tired grin of his own. "Sounds great, but I'll just have a rare steak." "Sure thing, hon," she winked and slipped the order through to the kitchen. Carson took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and overbrewed, but at least it was hot. The steak arrived, a generous cut perfectly seared on the outside and bleeding red at the center. The aroma was intoxicating. Carson cut off a slice and ate. It was succulent, unbelievably tender and rich. Yet as he devoured the meal, a faint unease crept in. Beneath the pepper and garlic, there was a peculiar sweetness to the meat's juice, a flavor he couldn't place. Something about it made his stomach flutter oddly. Carson was halfway through his meal when a heavy thump from the kitchen made him freeze, fork mid-bite. It was followed by a long, scraping drag, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. His nerves on edge, Carson called out, "Everything okay back there?" For a moment, only a crackle of static from a radio in the kitchen answered. Then Rhea poked her head out the door, still wearing that unwavering smile. A bead of sweat glinted on her brow. "All good, hon?" she chirped. "Just a sack of potatoes fell over, is all." Carson forced a nod, but the explanation rang hollow. Leaving the half-finished steak, Carson slid out of the booth. He needed to clear his head. A short hallway led to the restrooms at the back. The fluorescent light inside flickered to life, casting a sickly glow on pale green tiles. The cloying smell of lemon cleaner barely masked a coppery odor beneath. Carson's stomach clenched. He spotted dark red droplets behind the trash bin. Crouching, he found a fine spray of fresh blood trailing down the wall to a small sticky puddle on the floor. It hadn't even dried. His heart pounding, Carson stood. Something terrible had happened here, probably just minutes ago. He had to see what was going on in that kitchen. He crept down the hall toward a door marked "Staff Only." Just as he reached it, a muffled whimper sounded from the other side. Someone in pain. The faint cry cut off abruptly, sending a spike of dread through Carson. He pushed the door open and slipped inside. It was a pantry storage room, lit by a single hanging bulb. Racks of supplies lined the walls, and at the far end, a heavy walk-in freezer door stood slightly ajar. From behind it came a wet, crunching noise, like raw meat being chewed. Carson's boot hit something on the floor. A burlap sack spilled open with potatoes. Dark smears streaked the concrete around it. Swallowing hard, Carson flicked open his pocket knife and edged toward the freezer. In one swift motion, he yanked the freezer door wide and flicked on the light. The fluorescent glare revealed a scene from a nightmare. Slabs of human flesh hung from meat hooks on a rail along the ceiling. Skinless arms and legs, halves of torsos strung up like cuts of pork. Blood dripped in slow patters to the slick tiled floor, where plastic bins brimmed with mutilated organs. A burly, bald man in a blood-soaked apron stood hunched over a steel butcher's table in the center of the freezer. In his fists, he clutched a severed human arm, and he was gnawing on it like a feral beast. Gore smeared his face and hands. A rubbery strip of flesh dangled from his teeth as he tore upward, and then paused, noticing the sudden light. For a split second, Carson and the butcher locked eyes in mutual shock. Then the butcher let out a guttural snarl and hurled the half-eaten arm aside. "What the hell?" he roared, spitting out the meat. Carson stumbled back, gagging. He slammed shoulder first into a shelf, knocking over jars of pickles that shattered around his feet. Before he could turn, the butcher rushed at him. Carson cried out as the man's enormous weight rammed him against the shelves. The breath was crushed from his lungs. A powerful forearm, slick with blood, pressed against Carson's throat, pinning him in place. Carson gagged at the hot reek of carrion on the man's breath. Black spots swam in his vision. Desperate, he drove his knee up between the butcher's legs. The man barked in pain, his grip faltering. Carson wrenched free of the chokehold, gasping in a lungful of air. The butcher swung a ham-sized fist at him, but Carson ducked and slashed out with his pocket knife. The small blade sliced deep across the butcher's forearm. The butcher bellowed in agony as blood spurted from the wound. Carson didn't wait for a second chance. He tore himself out of the freezer and yanked the heavy door shut behind him. As he fled through the pantry, he heard the butcher's enraged howl echoing behind, followed by a tremendous slam as the man threw his weight at the freezer door. Carson stumbled back into the dining area, lungs burning, hands slick with blood that wasn't his. Rhea stood between him and the exit now, her once friendly demeanor transformed. Her pale blue uniform was spattered with dark stains, and her eyes glinted with manic intent. In her fist, she gripped a long, thin boning knife. "So you saw everything," she said quietly, stepping toward him. Carson's mind reeled. "Oh, God, you're cooking people," he gasped, voice trembling with fury and nausea. Rhea's red lips curled in a grotesque facsimile of a smile. "Only the folks nobody will miss, sugar. Waste not, want not." "You're insane," Carson spat. At that moment, a thunderous crash echoed from the kitchen as the butcher battered against the freezer door. Rhea glanced over her shoulder instinctively. Seizing the moment, Carson snatched up an empty plate from the counter and hurled it at her. The ceramic disc shattered against the side of her head, and she yelped, staggering. Carson lunged forward and drove his boot into her stomach, sending her sprawling to the tile. Her knife skittered from her hand. Carson scooped up the fallen boning knife and bolted for the door. But before he could reach it, the kitchen door burst open. The butcher, free of the freezer, charged out wielding a hefty butcher's cleaver. Blood streamed from a gash in his forearm, and his face was twisted in murderous rage. Carson skidded to a halt. Rhea was already scrambling up behind him, a crazed gleam in her eye as she grabbed a sharp carving fork from a table. He was trapped between them. The butcher roared and swung the cleaver at Carson's skull. Carson dove aside, and the blade smashed into a booth. splitting the vinyl and wedging into the wood. Before the butcher could yank it free, Carson slashed at him with the boning knife. The blade cut a deep gouge across the man's chest, but the hulking cannibal barely flinched. Rhea attacked from the other side, jabbing the two-pronged fork. The prongs raked into Carson's upper arm, hot pain blooming as they tore through flesh. He hissed and stumbled back against a table. With a feral snarl, Rhea pounced, trying to drive the fork into Carson's eyes. He caught her wrists just in time. They struggled in a deadly tableau, her snarling in his face, hot blood streaming from her broken nose onto him as she pressed the fork closer and closer. Carson summoned a surge of desperation and rammed his forehead into her face. Cartilage cracked. Rhea howled and tumbled backward, dropping the fork as she clutched her shattered nose. The butcher ripped his cleaver out of the ruined booth and came at Carson with an animal grunt. Carson whirled to meet him, the cleaver arced down. Carson sidestepped, the heavy blade whooshing past his ear. Before the butcher could recover, Carson drove forward and buried the boning knife to the hilt in the man's belly. The butcher gurgled, eyes bulging in surprise. Carson ripped the blade out, and a hot gout of blood spilled onto the floor. The big man staggered, dropping the cleaver as his hands fluttered stupidly to the gaping wound. He collapsed to his knees, then fell face first onto the tiles. "Papa!" Rhea screamed, her voice cracking. She lurched toward the butcher's crumpled body. A keening wail erupted from her throat as she realized he was dead. Blood still poured from her nose and soaked the front of her uniform. Slowly, Rhea reached down and picked up the bloody cleaver. Carson stepped back, panting, the boning knife trembling in his hand. "It's over," he rasped. But Rhea lifted her face toward him, and what he saw made him recoil. She was smiling. Her lips were drawn back in a crazed grin far too wide, baring teeth pink with her own blood. "Not yet, sweetie," she cooed, voice giddy and wet with pain. "I'm not done with you." She rushed at him, swinging the cleaver with all her remaining strength. Carson grabbed the first thing his fingers found, a large glass jar from the counter, and flung it into her chest. It struck hard. Rhea was knocked off balance and straight into the plate glass window. The window exploded outward with a tremendous crash, and Rhea disappeared through it in a shower of jagged shards, her scream cut off with a high, ugly gurgle. Heart pounding, Carson limped toward the gaping hole of the shattered window, wary of silhouettes in the darkness outside. He saw Rhea lying on her back amid the glittering pile of glass fragments on the asphalt. A massive shard of glass jutted from her throat. Blood sheeted down her neck, pooling around her head in a dark halo. Her chest hitched once in a weak, broken sob, and then she was still. Even in death, a ghastly smile remained frozen on her face, her mouth torn into a gruesome red grin by the shard that had sliced her cheeks open wide. Carson sagged against the fractured window frame, his entire body shaking. The night was silent again, except for the buzzing neon sign above. The stench of blood and cooked meat clung to the back of his throat. Suddenly, he doubled over and vomited, retching up the macabre meal he had unwittingly consumed. He spat out the last foul traces of it, wiping his mouth with a trembling hand. Fire-red dawn light was creeping into the sky when Carson finally climbed into his truck. His bloodied hands fumbled the keys, but the engine roared to life on the third try. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he couldn't bring himself to glance in the rear-view mirror. Behind him, the diner's neon sign blinked its final tired grin into the dimming night. Carson knew that no matter how many miles he put between himself and that hellish place, he would never really escape it. Verril's grin would haunt his dreams, the memory of the rot that smiles.
If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.